an original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Eliza Hartwell stands alone in the courtyard of Wycliffe Hall, rain streaming down her face as she tilts her head toward the storm-dark sky. Her arms hang loose at her sides, palms open, dress clinging to her frame, not fleeing, not sheltering, simply being. 10 feet away, beneath the stone portico, Graham Ashford, Duke of Wycliffe, extends a black umbrella toward her. His jaw tight, his posture perfect, despite the wind tearing at his coat. She does not look at him. His hand remains outstretched, an order wrapped in courtesy, and the space between them grows heavier with each second. She refuses to acknowledge it. He expects obedience. She offers him something far more dangerous, a woman who answers only to the compass of her own conscience. And in that moment, everything he believed about control begins to fracture. The rain had started without warning, the way summer storms do in the English countryside, sudden, thorough, indifferent. Graham had been standing at the library window when he saw her walk into it, not hurrying, not seeking shelter, walking directly into the downpour, as if it were an invitation. He'd grabbed the umbrella from the stand by the door, crossed the marble hall in 8 strides, pushed through the heavy oak doors into the wet afternoon. The courtyard stretched before him, gray stone darkening under the deluge, and there she was, his wife of 3 weeks, standing in the center of it, all with her face turned skyward. Eliza. His voice carried authority. It always had. Men twice his age deferred to it. Parliament listened when he spoke. His tenants touched their caps and stepped aside. She didn't move. He walked to the edge of the portico, where the rain formed a curtain between dry stone and open air, extended the umbrella toward her. You'll catch cold. Still she didn't turn. Her eyes were closed now. Rain ran in rivulets down her temples, soaked through the muslin of her afternoon dress, until the fabric clung to her shoulders, her arms. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, hanging heavy down her back. Eliza, firmer now. She opened her eyes, looked at the sky, not at him, and smiled. It wasn't defiance. That he could have managed, corrected, redirected, brought back into proper order. This was something else entirely. This was a woman so at peace in her own skin that his presence, his title, his perfectly reasonable request simply didn't signify. She lowered her gaze then, finally, and met his eyes across the rain-soaked space. It's only water, Your Grace. The words were gentle, almost kind, but they landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the careful architecture of his expectations. She turned away from him, walked 3 more steps into the courtyard, and lifted her face to the rain again. Graham lowered the umbrella slowly, watched water darken the shoulders of his coat, felt the cold seep through expensive wool. He had chosen Eliza Hartwell because she was sensible, mature, the daughter of minor gentry, illegitimate, yes, but educated by her guardian, a country clergyman of impeccable reputation. She had no romantic illusions, no expectations of grand passion. She understood what this marriage was. An arrangement. Practical, appropriate, mutually beneficial. He had expected a wife who would grace his table, honor his name, and maintain the impeccable order of Wycliffe Hall. He had not expected this. She stood there another full minute, rain drumming against stone, before she finally turned and walked back toward the house. As she passed him, water streaming from her hem, she paused. Thank you for your concern. Her voice was steady, warm even, but I wasn't in need of rescue. She disappeared through the oak doors, leaving a trail of wet footprints across the marble. Graham stood alone beneath the portico, umbrella hanging useless in his hand, and felt the first hairline crack appear in the foundation of everything he thought he understood about marriage, duty, and control. Graham Ashford had inherited his title at 19, his estate at 20, and his convictions about order sometime in between. Wycliffe Hall was a study in precision. 300 acres of parkland, maintained to perfection. Tenant farms that ran like clockwork. A household staff of 27, each with clearly defined duties, each performing them without fuss or drama. The library catalogued by subject and date. The account books balanced to the penny. The social calendar managed 3 months in advance. His late mother had built this system, and Graham had maintained it with religious devotion. She had taught him that a great house was like a great ship. It required a firm hand at the helm, clear hierarchies, and absolute consistency. Chaos, she'd said, was the enemy of dignity. He had believed her. Still did, mostly. Which was why, at 32, when the time came to marry, he had approached the matter with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. He needed a duchess. Someone who understood the responsibilities of the position, who would manage the household with grace, represent the family in society, and, crucially, not disrupt the careful equilibrium he had spent a decade perfecting. Eliza Hartwell had seemed ideal. She was 30, old enough to have set aside girlish fantasies. She had been raised in genteel poverty after her father, a baronet, refused to acknowledge her existence. Her guardian, Reverend Hartwell, had educated her well: literature, languages, practical household management. She had no fortune, no prospects, and no illusions about her place in the world. When Graham's solicitor made the offer, she had accepted with calm pragmatism. The wedding had been quiet, correct, efficient, and for the first 2 days after she arrived at Wycliffe Hall, Graham had thought himself remarkably fortunate. Then came the third morning. He found her in the entrance hall, dressed for walking, speaking with Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper. The village school, Eliza was saying. How far is it? Mrs. Dawes glanced at Graham, uncertain. Perhaps a mile, Your Grace. Down the south road. Excellent. I should like to visit this morning. Graham cleared his throat. I had thought to show you the drawing room and the conservatory. We're hosting the quarterly assembly in 6 weeks. You'll need to familiarize yourself with the arrangements. Eliza turned to him with that same calm, untroubled expression she'd worn in the rain. Of course, this afternoon, perhaps. I should like to see the school first. It wasn't defiance. It was simply redirection. The school. He kept his voice even. May I ask why? I taught at the parish school near my guardian's home for 7 years. I'm curious to see how yours is managed. I see. He didn't really. I'm not certain the schoolmistress is expecting. Then it will be an informal visit. She smiled. I promise not to disrupt the lessons. She was out the door before he could formulate a proper objection. That afternoon, when she returned, she said nothing about the conservatory or the drawing room. Instead, at dinner, she asked him about enrollment numbers, the curriculum, whether the children had sufficient books. He answered as best he could. He funded the school, certainly, but he had never concerned himself with its daily operations. Perhaps you should, she said gently. The days that followed established a pattern. Eliza rose early, walked the estate, learned the names of servants Graham had never thought to ask. She spent mornings in the village, afternoons in the library, evenings at dinner, where she asked questions that made him uncomfortably aware of how little he knew about the lives lived just beyond his perfectly maintained lawns. She never argued, never raised her voice, never directly contradicted him. She simply existed according to her own compass. When he suggested she might want to redecorate the duchess's chambers, she thanked him and left them exactly as they were. When he mentioned that the Duchess of Wycliffe traditionally hosted a monthly tea for the wives of local gentry, she agreed pleasantly, and then invited the schoolmistress and the vicar's wife as well. When he explained carefully that there were certain boundaries between family and staff that must be maintained, she nodded thoughtfully and continued taking her morning tea in the kitchen with Mrs. Dawes. It was like trying to redirect water. It simply flowed around every obstacle, following its own course. 3 weeks into the marriage, Lord Talbot came to dinner. He was an old friend of Graham's late father, a man of firm opinions and little patience for modern sentiment. Over the roast, he made a joke about one of Graham's tenants, a farmer who'd fallen behind on rent after his barn burned. Should have saved more, Talbot said, cutting into his beef. Can't expect charity every time fortune turns. Eliza, who had been listening quietly, set down her fork. She didn't speak, didn't move, simply sat there, her gaze resting on Talbot with such pointed stillness that the conversation faltered, stumbled, died. The silence stretched. Talbot shifted in his chair. Graham's aunt, seated at the far end, cleared her throat nervously. Finally, Eliza picked up her fork again and resumed eating. The dinner limped to its conclusion. After the guests departed, Graham found her in the library. You embarrassed Lord Talbot. She looked up from her book. Did I? Your silence was pointed. Was it? She closed the book, marking her place with one finger. I thought his comment was pointed. I simply declined to laugh at it. He's an important connection. His support in Parliament. is not worth the dignity of a man who lost everything in a fire. Her voice remained calm, maddeningly calm. If Lord Talbot is embarrassed by his own cruelty, perhaps he should examine the cruelty, not my silence. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, found he had no response that didn't sound petty. She returned to her book. He left the library feeling, for the first time in years, that he had lost an argument he hadn't even known he was having. That night, alone in his chambers, Graham sat by the window and stared out at the darkened grounds. He had wanted a wife who would fit seamlessly into his world. Instead, he had married a woman who was quietly, relentlessly, reshaping it, and he had no idea what to do about it. The household began to change in ways Graham couldn't quite name. Nothing dramatic. Nothing he could point to and say, "This is wrong. This must stop." Just small shifts, like furniture moved an inch to the left, barely noticeable, until you walked into it in the dark. The servants smiled more, spoke more freely in the halls. Mrs. Dawes hummed while arranging flowers. The footmen no longer stood quite so rigidly at attention. When Eliza passed, she learned their names. All of them. Not just the housekeeper and butler, but the scullery maids, the grooms, the boy who tended the fires. Graham watched her stop young Thomas in the corridor one morning, ask after his mother, who'd been ill. Watched Thomas stammer out an answer, clearly shocked that the Duchess knew his mother existed, let alone her state of health. "Give her my regards," Eliza said, "and tell her Mrs. Dawes has a tonic that might help. I'll make sure she receives it." After Thomas fled, Graham stepped out from the doorway where he'd been standing. "You'll spoil them." Eliza turned, unsurprised. "Will I?" Familiarity breeds presumption. Does it? I found it breeds loyalty. She tilted her head slightly. "But perhaps our experiences differ." She moved past him, leaving a faint scent of lavender and rain-washed linen. He wanted to call her back, explain properly, make her understand that there were structures, hierarchies, reasons things were done the way they'd always been done. But she was already gone, and he was left standing in the empty corridor, feeling obscurely foolish. The village school became her fixed point. She went 3 times a week, sometimes 4. She brought books from the Wycliffe Library, volumes Graham hadn't known they owned. She sat with the children, helped them sound out words, praised their crooked letters. The schoolmistress, Miss Pemberton, had been wary at first. Graham heard it from his steward, who heard it from the vicar. A duchess in the schoolroom was unprecedented, disruptive, inappropriate. Within a fortnight, Miss Pemberton was asking Eliza's opinion on curriculum. Graham should have put a stop to it. He didn't. He told himself it was harmless, a charitable impulse. She'd tire of it eventually. But weeks passed, and she didn't tire. If anything, she became more present, not just at the school, but in the village itself. She visited the sick with the vicar's wife. She wrote letters for tenants who couldn't write themselves. She listened to the elderly widow at Rose Cottage describe her late husband's service in the Navy, and somehow convinced Graham to increase the woman's pension. "She's 73, Eliza said over breakfast, as if this explained everything. "And her roof leaks. The estate provides standard support for her roof leaks." Graham. He'd signed the increase that afternoon. That evening, he'd found himself standing in his study, staring at the ledger, wondering when exactly he'd lost control of his own household finances. The breaking point came at dinner 3 weeks later. His cousin Frederick was visiting, a baronet from Hampshire, pompous and self-satisfied. Over the soup course, he launched into a complaint about the ingratitude of the lower classes. "Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. My tenants wanted a school. A school. As if their children need Latin." Graham made a non-committal sound. Eliza said nothing. "I told them, you want education. Pay for it yourselves." Frederick laughed. "They haven't mentioned it since." Eliza set down her spoon very carefully. "How many children on your estate, Mr. Ashford?" Frederick blinked. I'm not certain. 30, 40. "And how many of them can read?" "I've no idea." "Why should it matter?" "Because illiterate children become illiterate adults, and illiterate adults remain poor, desperate, and dependent." Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "If you want grateful tenants, perhaps giving them the tools to improve their circumstances would be more effective than ensuring they remain helpless." Frederick's face reddened. "I hardly think." "No," Eliza said gently. "You don't." She returned to her soup. The silence was excruciating. After Frederick departed the next morning, earlier than planned, Graham found Eliza in the garden. That was unacceptable. She looked up from the roses she'd been examining. Was it? He's family. He's cruel. He has certain views. Yes, cruel ones. She straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. I won't apologize for saying what's true, Graham. Not even to spare your cousin's pride. This isn't about truth. It's about propriety, no. She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something harder beneath the calm. It's about whether you value propriety more than people. And I think you do. I think you've built your entire life around it. The words hit like a slap. That's not fair, isn't it? She pulled off her gloves, tucked them into her pocket. You're a good man, Graham. I've seen the evidence. But you're so afraid of disrupting the order your mother built that you've forgotten to ask whether that order actually serves anyone beyond yourself. She walked past him, back toward the house. He stood among the roses, chest tight, hands clenched at his sides. She was wrong. She had to be wrong. But that night alone, he couldn't stop replaying her words. You've forgotten to ask whether that order actually serves anyone beyond yourself. He lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, and found no answer that satisfied him. Summer deepened. The estate settled into its rhythms, harvest preparations, tenant visits, the endless small machinery of a great house, and somewhere in the midst of it, Graham stopped trying to manage his wife. Not consciously, not as a decision. It simply happened. He stopped reminding her of social obligations she'd already quietly fulfilled in her own way. Stopped suggesting how she might better occupy her time. Stopped waiting for her to fail at being the duchess he'd imagined. Instead, he watched. He watched her convince Mrs. Dawes to try a new method for organizing the linen cupboards, more efficient, less wasteful. Watched the housekeeper's initial resistance melt into grudging approval, then genuine enthusiasm. He watched her sit with the head groom's daughter, who'd been injured in a fall, reading to the girl for an hour, while the child's mother wept with gratitude. He watched her organize a lending library in the village, using books from Wycliffe's collection that hadn't been touched in decades. Small things, practical things, things that made life measurably better for people he'd never thought to consider. One evening, he found her in the estate library, surrounded by account books. What are you doing? She glanced up, trying to understand the crop rotation schedule. Mr. Hendricks mentioned that the south fields have been yielding poorly, and I thought. She paused. Is this inappropriate? I can stop. He should have said yes. The estate's agricultural management was not the Duchess's concern. Instead, he pulled up a chair. The south fields have always been difficult. Poor drainage. Have you considered clover? Clover, as a cover crop, to restore the soil. She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a notation. The vicar's brother is a farmer in Derbyshire. He's had success with it. Graham leaned forward, studying the numbers. I hadn't thought of that. They spent the next hour discussing field rotation, drainage solutions, and whether the estate could afford to let land lie fallow for a season. It was the longest conversation they'd had that didn't end in tension. When she finally closed the ledger, she smiled at him, not the polite smile she offered at dinner parties, but something warmer, more real. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring, he said, and meant it. The small intimacies accumulated. He began leaving the library lamp burning when he retired, knowing she often read late. She ensured his tea was prepared exactly as he preferred. Strong, no sugar, a slice of lemon. He stopped correcting her. She stopped withdrawing. They fell into an unspoken routine. Breakfast together, days spent in separate pursuits. Dinner, where they actually talked, not about society gossip or estate formalities, but about ideas, problems, solutions. One night, overpoured in the drawing room, she asked about his mother. What was she like? He stiffened reflexively. Capable, organized. That's not what I asked. He stared into his glass. She was exacting. She believed a great house required absolute standards. No compromise. Did you love her? The question caught him off guard. Of course. But did you like her? He opened his mouth, closed it, found himself laughing, a short, bitter sound. I don't know. I never thought to ask. Eliza said nothing, just sat there waiting. She was formidable, he said finally. Everyone respected her. But I don't think anyone was ever at ease around her, including me. That sounds lonely. It was duty. Duty can be lonely too. He looked at her then, really looked. at the way lamplight softened her features, the quiet strength in her posture, the absence of judgment in her eyes. "You're nothing like her," he said. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know." He set down his glass. "I thought it would be. But it's not. It's just different. Different isn't always bad, Graham." "No," he said slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that." The shift came gradually, then all at once. A tenant farmer, William Marsh, came to the house one morning requesting an audience. Graham received him in the study, Eliza present at her own request. Marsh twisted his cap in his hands. "It's the rent, Your Grace. I'm 3 months behind. I know that's not acceptable, but my son," his voice broke. "My son drowned in the spring floods. He was my help with the harvest. Without him, I couldn't manage the full planting." Graham's first instinct was automatic. Rules existed for a reason. Exceptions set dangerous precedents. "I understand your loss, Mr. Marsh. But the estate has obligations, of course, Your Grace. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just time. Another season. I'll make it right, I swear." Graham prepared to refuse. Firmly, kindly, but refused nonetheless. Then he glanced at Eliza. She wasn't looking at him, wasn't signaling, just sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap, gaze resting on Marsh with such evident compassion that Graham felt something crack open in his chest. He thought of his mother, of rules, of order, of a 14-year-old boy drowned and a father left to manage alone. 2 seasons, Graham heard himself say, "and I'll send help for the harvest. No charge." Marsh's eyes filled. "Your Grace, that will be all, Mr. Marsh." After the man left, Graham sat very still. Eliza rose, crossed to him, rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I broke precedent. You did the right thing. They're not always the same." "No," she agreed. "But perhaps they should be." That night, Graham stood at his chamber window and realized something that should have terrified him. He had stopped trying to fit Eliza into his world. He was beginning to wonder if his world needed to change to fit her. The rain came again in late August, not the violent summer storm of their first encounter, but a steady, gray drizzle that settled over the estate like a held breath. Eliza had been restless all morning. Graham noticed it at breakfast, the way she kept glancing toward the windows, her tea cooling, untouched. "Are you well?" "Yes, just," she set down her cup. "I think I'll walk. In this weather. It's only rain." That small smile again. "I won't melt." She left before he could respond. He tried to return to his correspondence. Managed perhaps 10 minutes before the pull became irresistible. He told himself he was being ridiculous. She was a grown woman. She could walk in the rain if she wished, but he found himself at the window nonetheless, scanning the grounds. There, a figure in a dark cloak, moving along the tree line toward the village. He should let her go. She valued her independence. He was learning to respect it. Instead, he grabbed his coat. He followed at a distance, keeping to the shelter of the oaks that lined the south road. She walked with purpose, not wandering, heading somewhere specific. The old churchyard. Graham stopped at the stone wall, watching as she passed through the iron gate. The church itself was Norman, half-ruined, no longer used for services. But the graveyard remained, tended by the vicar out of respect for the dead. Eliza moved through the rows of tilted headstones, deeper into the cemetery, until she reached the far corner, where the graves were simpler, newer, and stopped. Graham couldn't see clearly from where he stood. He moved closer, using the wall for cover, until he had a clear line of sight. Then he froze. It wasn't Eliza at the grave. It was him. Graham Ashford, Duke of Wycliffe, kneeling in the wet grass, placing wildflowers at the base of a plain headstone. For a moment, Graham thought he was seeing things, some trick of rain and distance. But no, that was his coat, his posture, his hands, so careful with the flowers. Eliza stood 20 feet away, half hidden behind a yew tree, watching. The Graham at the grave bowed his head, stayed there, motionless, rain darkening his shoulders. The real Graham, watching from the wall, felt his throat close. He'd been so careful, so discreet. Monthly visits, always alone, always early morning or late evening when no one would see. His mother had made it clear. A duke did not publicly mourn a servant. It was unseemly, excessive. It set the wrong tone. So he'd mourned privately. For 4 years. And now Eliza knew. He didn't confront her, didn't mention it. But that evening, when he came down for dinner, there were wildflowers in the hall vase. The same type he'd left at the grave. Meadowsweet and clover, tied with rough twine. Eliza was already seated. She looked up as he entered, and their eyes met. She didn't say anything. Didn't ask. Just looked at him with something that might have been understanding, or sadness, or both. He took his seat, unfolded his napkin. Sarah Millbrook, he said quietly. She was 14, a scullery maid. She died of fever 4 years ago. Eliza waited. I paid for the physician, for her care, but it wasn't enough. He stared at his plate. My mother forbade me to attend the funeral, said it would be inappropriate, that servants understood their place, and I mustn't blur the lines. But you visit her grave every month. Why? He looked up then, met her eyes. Because she mattered. Because her life had value, even if no one else acknowledged it. Because his voice cracked. Because someone should remember her. The silence stretched. Then Eliza rose, crossed to him, and did something she'd never done before. She took his hand. You're a better man than you let yourself believe, she said softly. I'm a coward. I couldn't even mourn her properly. You mourned her the only way you could. That's not cowardice, Graham. That's love under impossible constraint. She squeezed his hand. But you don't have to hide anymore. He looked at their joined hands, at the wildflowers in the vase, at this woman who'd walked into his life like rain through an open window, and refused to be anything other than exactly who she was. I don't know how to be what you need, he said. I don't need you to be anything. I just need you to be honest. With yourself. With me. She smiled. With Sarah's memory. That night, Graham stood in his chambers and wept for the first time since his mother's funeral. Not from grief, from relief. Because for the first time in his life, someone had seen the man beneath the title and hadn't turned away. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Graham's aunt, the Dowager Countess of Pembridge, would be visiting, along with Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Edgecombe, 2 pillars of county society, women whose approval could make or break a family's reputation. They're coming to inspect you, Graham said over breakfast, the letter still in his hand. Eliza looked up from her tea. Inspect. There's been talk about your informality. I see. She set down her cup. And what would you like me to do? Nothing. I'll handle it. But he didn't sound convinced. And they both knew it. The women arrived 3 days later in a flurry of silk and judgment. Lady Pembridge swept through the entrance hall like a general surveying a battlefield. Graham, you look well. And this must be the new Duchess. Aunt Catherine. He kissed her cheek. May I present my wife, Eliza, your grace. Eliza curtsied, perfect and correct. Lady Pembridge's eyes were sharp, assessing. Charming. I'm sure we'll have much to discuss. They descended like a well-trained army. Lady Thornbury took over the morning room, rearranging the seating to her preference. Mrs. Edgecombe inspected the household schedules, making pointed comments about the informality of certain arrangements. Lady Pembridge installed herself in the Duchess's private sitting room and began issuing directives. The Duchess of Wycliffe does not take tea in the kitchen. The Duchess of Wycliffe does not visit tenants unaccompanied. The Duchess of Wycliffe certainly does not teach at the village school. Eliza listened, nodded, said very little. Graham watched her begin to disappear. Not physically, but the light in her eyes dimmed. The ease in her movements became careful. She smiled at the right moments, agreed to the appropriate suggestions, and slowly, methodically, erased herself. By the 3rd day, she barely spoke at meals. By the 4th, she stopped walking the grounds. On the 5th evening, Graham found her in the library, staring into the fire. They'll be gone soon, he said. She didn't look at him. Will they? Another few days. And then what? I go back to being myself, until the next inspection. Her voice was flat, tired. How many times do I have to prove I'm unsuitable, Graham? You're not unsuitable. Then why do you let them tell me I am? He had no answer. She stood, moved toward the door, then paused. I thought I could be myself, and your wife. Perhaps I was naive. She looked back at him, and he saw something he'd never seen before. Defeat. I won't pretend, Graham. Not even for you. If that makes me unsuitable for this life, then perhaps I should leave. Eliza, but she was gone. Graham stood in the empty library, the fire crackling, and felt the walls of his carefully ordered world closing in. He found Lady Pembridge in the drawing room, writing correspondence. We need to talk. She set down her pen. Of course, you're trying to change her. We're trying to help her understand her position. She understands perfectly. You're trying to make her into something she's not. Graham. His aunt's voice was patient, condescending. Your mother built a legacy. This estate, this family, we have standards. Your wife is charming in her way, but she's inappropriate. She needs guidance. She needs to be herself. That's the problem. Lady Pembridge stood. She's too much herself. A duchess is not an individual, Graham. She's a role, a symbol. Your mother understood that. My mother was miserable. The words hung in the air. Lady Pembridge's face hardened. Your mother was dutiful. She was lonely. She was rigid. She built a perfect house and forgot to make it a home. Graham's voice was rising, but he couldn't stop. And I've spent my entire life trying to maintain her legacy. And it's killing me. It's killing us. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest. He took a breath. Eliza is the best thing that's ever happened to this estate. To me. And if you can't see that, then perhaps you should leave. His aunt stared at him. You would choose her over your family. She is my family. Lady Pembridge gathered her things in tight-lipped silence. The other women followed suit. They were gone by morning. Graham found Eliza in the garden at dawn. They've left. She nodded, didn't turn around. I told them to go. Now she looked at him. Why? Because they were wrong. Because you're exactly who you should be. Because he stopped, started again. I've spent my whole life building walls. You walked through them as if they were mist. And I was so afraid of what that meant that I let them try to cage you. Graham, I don't know how to be what you need. His voice cracked. I don't know how to be the man who deserves you. She crossed to him, took his face in her hands. I don't need a duke, Graham. I need a man who can be honest, who can be present. That's all I've ever needed. I'm trying, I know. She smiled, soft and sad. But trying isn't enough if you're still afraid of what honesty costs. She kissed his forehead and walked back toward the house. Graham stood alone among the roses and realized with perfect clarity he could keep his perfect world, his impeccable reputation, his mother's legacy, or he could keep Eliza, but he couldn't have both. The announcement arrived 2 days later. Lady Pembridge, in a final act of aristocratic warfare, had arranged a public inspection of the village school. The entire county gentry would attend. The stated purpose, to evaluate the appropriateness of the duchess's involvement in local education. The actual purpose, to humiliate Eliza into submission. Graham read the notice with cold fury. You don't have to go, he said. Eliza, seated across from him at breakfast, was perfectly calm. Yes, I do. They're trying to embarrass you. Let them try. She folded her napkin. I've done nothing wrong. The children are learning. The school is thriving. If the county wants to condemn that, they'll have to do it to my face. Eliza, I'm not running, Graham. She met his eyes. Not from them. Not from this. If I leave now, they win. And I won't give them that satisfaction. He wanted to argue, wanted to forbid her to go, to protect her from what was coming. But he was learning, finally, that Eliza didn't need protection. She needed an ally. The day of the inspection was gray and still. Graham dressed with unusual care. Not in his usual country attire, but in full formal dress, the kind reserved for Parliament, for audiences with the crown. If this was to be a battlefield, he would dress the part. He arrived at the school to find the small building surrounded by carriages. The gentry of 3 counties had turned out, drawn by the promise of scandal. Inside, the schoolroom was packed. The children sat at their desks, nervous and confused. Miss Pemberton stood at the front, pale but composed. And there, beside the teacher's desk, stood Eliza. She wore a simple day dress. No jewels, no ostentation. Just herself, steady and calm, facing a room full of people who'd come to watch her fail. Lady Pembridge stood near the door, flanked by Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Edgecombe. Ah, Graham, how good of you to join us. His aunt's smile was poisonous. We were just about to begin our evaluation. Graham said nothing, walked through the crowd, and took his place beside his wife. The room fell silent. Eliza glanced at him, surprised. He didn't look at her, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, facing the assembled gentry. Lady Pembridge's smile faltered. Graham, this is hardly. My wife's work here reflects the values of this estate. His voice was quiet, absolute. Any question of her judgment is a question of mine. You cannot possibly, I can. And I do. He turned to face his aunt fully. The Duchess of Wycliffe has brought more good to this community in 4 months than I managed in 10 years. If you find that inappropriate, the fault lies not with her, but with the system that taught us to value propriety over people. Lady Thornbury drew herself up. Your mother would be appalled. My mother was wrong. The words fell like stones. She built a beautiful prison and called it duty. She taught me that order mattered more than compassion, that reputation mattered more than truth, and I believed her. Until I married a woman who showed me what real dignity looks like. He looked at Eliza then. Really looked at her. She doesn't need my permission. She doesn't need my approval. But she has my respect, my admiration, and my absolute support. He turned back to the crowd. If any of you wish to condemn her, you'll have to condemn me as well, because I will not stand aside while you try to diminish the best thing that's ever happened to this family. The silence was deafening. Then from the back of the room, one of the tenant mothers began to clap, slowly, deliberately. Another joined her. Another. The children, uncertain, began to clap as well. The sound built, filled the small room, until even some of the gentry, the younger ones, the ones tired of the old rigidity, joined in. Lady Pembridge stood frozen, her face white with fury. Then she turned and walked out. Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Edgecombe followed. Half the room emptied behind them, but half remained. That evening, back at Wycliffe Hall, Graham found Eliza in their chambers. She was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. You've lost allies. Your aunt will never forgive you. I don't care. She turned then. Graham, I spent my whole life building walls. His voice was rough, trying to be perfect, trying to maintain a legacy that was never mine to begin with. And all it did was make me lonely. He crossed to her, and for the first time, allowed himself to be completely unguarded. You walked into my life and showed me what I was missing. Connection, purpose, truth. His throat tightened. I don't know how to be what you need. I don't know how to be the man who deserves you. But I'm trying. God help me, I'm trying. Graham, his knees buckled. Not from weakness, from surrender. He sank down before her, hands reaching for hers, and for the first time in his adult life, allowed himself to be vulnerable. I don't need to be a duke, he said, voice breaking. I just need to be yours. Broken walls and all. Eliza knelt with him, taking his face in her hands. You were never broken, Graham. You were just alone. She kissed him then, not with passion, but with profound tenderness. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. And neither am I. They stayed there, kneeling together on the floor of their chambers, while outside the last light faded, and the world turned dark. But inside, finally, there was light. 3 months later, autumn settled over Wycliffe Hall with gentle gold light, and the smell of wood smoke. The estate had changed, subtly, but unmistakably. The servants laughed more freely. The tenants came to the house without fear. The village school had doubled its enrollment, and Graham had funded an expansion. Some families had cut ties. Lady Pembridge refused to acknowledge Graham's existence. 2 seats in Parliament that had been promised to him quietly went to others. Graham didn't flinch. He'd learned, finally, that some losses were worth the gain. One morning in late October, he walked to the village school. It was early. The children hadn't arrived yet. But Eliza was there, arranging books on the new shelves they'd built over the summer. She looked up as he entered, smiled. You're up early. Couldn't sleep. Bad dreams. Good ones, actually. She laughed, that warm sound that had become as familiar as breathing. They worked together in comfortable silence, shelving books, straightening desks. Outside, the first children began to arrive, their voices bright in the morning air. A little girl, Mary, the blacksmith's daughter, came running in, clutching a primer. She stumbled, and the book flew from her hands. Graham bent without thinking, retrieved it, handed it back with a quiet smile. Careful now. Thank you, Your Grace. She curtsied, clumsy and earnest, then ran to her seat. Graham straightened and found Eliza watching him. She was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression soft. What, he asked. Nothing. She shook her head. Just, what about me? You're kneeling in schoolrooms now, picking up books, smiling at children. She crossed to him, took his hand. A year ago, you wouldn't have noticed she dropped it. A year ago, I wouldn't have been here. No, Eliza agreed. You wouldn't have. She squeezed his hand, and they stood there together, watching the children settle into their seats, listening to Miss Pemberton begin the morning lesson. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling golden light across the village green. Graham looked down at their joined hands, at this woman who'd refused to bend, who'd walked through his walls as if they were mist, who taught him that surrender wasn't defeat. It was freedom. "I love you," he said quietly. Eliza looked up at him, eyes bright. "I know. Do you love me? What do you think?" He smiled. "I think you're going to make me say it first. I think you just did. That doesn't count, doesn't it?" She laughed, rose on her toes, kissed him softly. "Yes, Graham. I love you. Your broken walls and all." They walked back to the hall together, hand in hand, through the autumn morning. Behind them, the children's voices rose in recitation, clear and bright. Ahead, the great house stood against the sky, still imposing, still beautiful, but no longer a prison, just a home. And that, Graham thought, was more than enough. He'd expected a wife who would obey. Instead, he'd found a woman who taught him the only true surrender: to love without armor, to live without walls, to kneel not in defeat, but in the quiet grace of becoming whole.